Okay, good evening, everyone. Thank you all for tuning in to today's speaker event, Reuniting the Divided Korean Family, co-hosted by Alliance for Korea United and Liberty in North Korea at Boston University. My name is Namshik Yu, and I will be moderating tonight's event. We are truly honored to have two very special people here with us tonight who will share their stories and the incredible work they do regarding the issue of divided families. So in terms of the schedule for today's event, we will open with some brief remarks, followed by our two guest speakers, Paul Kyumin Lee and Chahee Lee Stanfield. We will then have a Q&A session and then close with a group photo and the link BU giveaway. So a few things to note for everyone on the call: you will be muted throughout the event until the Q&A session. This is to ensure that everything runs smoothly with no technical difficulties. However, the chat box will be open the entire time, and you can use the chat box to ask any questions to our speakers during the event. So to start off, I would like to introduce the president of Liberty in North Korea at Boston University, Emma Cowan, to share the work that their rescue team has been doing this past school year. So let's welcome up Emma.
Hi, my name is Emma Cowan. I am representing BU Link as their president. I would like to give a big thank you to everyone so much for coming to the event tonight. It really means the world to us, and I hope that the stories and the information that will be shared tonight can mean as much to you. So BU Link is a chapter of the larger nonprofit organization Liberty in North Korea. As a college chapter, we work in fundraising and educational events such as this one. I'd like to give a quick shout out to my wonderful e-board who worked tirelessly throughout the semester to set up events like this. They are so fantastic and have been working so hard despite being full-time students, and they make me really happy and proud to be a part of their team. If you're interested in staying involved with us, we have another speaker event in a few weeks. James Yoon, our speaker, will share videos and stories about his time tutoring English in North Korea. We have a fundraiser coming up at the Middle East restaurant in Cambridge. All the money that we make from our fundraisers goes directly back to North Korean refugees. And finally, our biggest annual event, Running Man, will be on April the 9th. If you're a student, you can set up a team, sign up, and participate in mini games to win great prizes. We're also having a little fundraiser for this event, and submissions close at 6:30, so around 30 minutes Eastern time. And it's $1 one entry. You can find the form to donate on our Instagram at @BULinkKorea. Again, thank you for coming. Big thanks to Namshik for setting this up for us. And thank you to our speakers, Chahee and Paul, for speaking to us tonight. We are so honored to have you.
All right, thank you so much, Emma, for quickly giving that brief introduction of Link BU. So next, I would like to briefly introduce our org, Alliance for Korea United, and the vision that we promote for Korean reunification. So nowadays, when most of us, when we think of Korea, we normally think of things like K-pop and BTS, Korean dramas, or we think about what's on the news on TV, whether it be about North Korea, its missile strikes, or Kim Jong-un. However, there's so much more to Korea than what is currently portrayed right now in the media. Right now, Korea is the only divided nation in the world, and ever since the Korean War, North and South have gone their separate paths. But the question that we should be asking ourselves is, should it continue to be this way when in fact the Koreans have always been one people? And there are some that are skeptical about reunification, saying it would be unrealistic or unnecessary or too expensive. However, this lasting division has had major consequences, not only on the Korean people, but also on the entire world. So today, North Korea presents an ongoing global security threat with its nuclear weapons. In addition, the 25 million people being condemned to live in North Korea are subject to the most egregious human rights violations. And the biggest human tragedy of division is the separation of millions of families. And there are still so many Koreans, including here in America, that have yet to see their loved ones in North Korea, as we will dive more into in today's event. So we believe that the solution to tackle these pressing issues is peaceful reunification based on the vision of the Korean dream. So you may ask yourselves, what exactly is the Korean dream? As expressed in the award-winning book of that name, it is the enduring aspiration of the Korean people to create a free and unified nation that is rooted in Korea's founding, founding spirit known as 홍익 인간, which means living for the benefit of all humanity. And we believe it is this virtuous and selfless spirit that will allow the Korean people to come together and be inspired to build a new nation. So although the Korean people have been divided now for over 75 years, it pales in comparison to 5,000 years of shared history, language, culture, and traditions. Unlike previous efforts toward reunification, which were facilitated mainly on the level of government, the Korean dream calls for a grassroots movement where the people bring about change. And Alliance for Korea United aims to gather broad-based support in the Korean diaspora communities here in America. We believe America is really positioned to play a major support role for a unified Korea, especially as the champion of human rights and a longstanding ally and friend to the ROK. In addition, one piece of US history that many of us forget and that I was not also aware of before is a significant role that Korean Americans played during the March 1st independence movement in 1919. So the first Koreans that immigrated to the US during the early 1900s actually became the most vocal advocates and supporters for a free and unified Korea during Japanese occupation, including people like Philip Jason and An Chang-ho, Syngman Rhee. So today, as Korea is still divided, we want to ignite that fire again and inspire Korean Americans to participate in the efforts toward reuniting their homeland. So that is what we are aiming to do here in AKU. So in terms of the work that we've done recently, AKU has co-sponsored various international forums on One Korea, which is where prominent scholars, policy experts, and civil society leaders discuss the current circumstances on the Korean Peninsula. And actually this past Sunday, we hosted an online event to commemorate the 103rd anniversary of the Samil independence movement to learn about the early Korean American leaders and their significant role in supporting a free and independent Korea. And on the youth side, we have been engaging university students through our cultural exchange and language program, Imagine Your Korean Dream, along with speaker events like this one, where we can raise more awareness on these various important Korea-related issues. So that is it for my presentation. If you want to learn more about AKU and our work, you can check out our website, our YouTube, and social media. The links will be posted in the chat box. So before introducing our guest speakers, I would like to play a short video from the 2021 International Forum on One Korea, where we had US congressional representatives make remarks on the tragedy of family separation due to a divided Korean peninsula and expressing their support for a unified Korea. So let's play the video.
There are important parallels in our country with the Korean situation, which has now continued for more than 70 years. We know the pain of division felt by countless separated families that could never see or even speak to each other again. That is so painful.
Our stance today reminds me of a time not that long ago in 1987 when President Reagan was there at the Berlin Wall and was there standing for reunification there in Germany. And today we stand instead, I believe, on the 38th parallel. And we see families that have been tragically separated for over 70 years and the real need to make sure that we are reunifying those families. It is heartbreaking to see families that have been separated for so long.
As a Korean American, I pray for a day when we will see a unified, free, and peaceful Korean peninsula. And I yearn to see the day that divided families are reunited for good.
That my both parents came from North Korea, and they've been talking about it while they were alive. Actually, my mom passed away 10 years ago, and she's been talking about her family members. Until she died, she's been talking about this matter every day, and she wanted to go to North Korea. She applied all these special meetings every time. She failed. It's not really fair that we are excluding these members that, because they are Korean Americans.
All right, so that was the video. And I would like to now introduce our first speaker for tonight's event. Paul Kyumin Lee is a program specialist for youth programs at the United States Institute of Peace and the president of Divided Families USA, an NGO that advocates for a formal mechanism for Korean Americans to reunite with their relatives in North Korea. He also co-produces the Divided Families podcast, a platform for connecting stories of family separation. Paul previously worked in the China and North Korea program at USIP. Before joining USIP, he worked in the Asia program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Paul graduated from Yale University with a bachelor's in political science and speaks Korean, Mandarin, Japanese, and Spanish. So let's all welcome up Paul Kyumin Lee.
Thanks so much, Namsik and Alliance for Korea United USA for hosting this amazing event. And I just want to give a huge shout out to the BU Link chapter, Emma Cowan and her team, her e-board, just because I'm just amazed that so many people, 40 people, decided to show up to an event on this issue on a Friday evening, much less an event on Zoom. So I was telling Emma before that when I was in college, I was very involved with the North Korean Human Rights Organization, and we really struggled to entice people with pizza, but we should have thought of these giveaways and Running Man and other ways to get people to show up. So this is really, really heartwarming to see. So just in terms of what I'm going to share today, and I would love to hear some questions later on as well. I'm just going to share a bit about my own personal background, how I became interested in this issue of Korean American divided families. And then I'll share a bit about what Divided Families USA, my organization, has been doing to work on this issue. And then finally, I'll share a bit about what you all, wherever you are in the world, however old or young you are, can do to support this issue on reuniting divided families. So I'm just going to share a couple of slides. Just a moment. So some of you may already be familiar with the issue of families separated from the Korean War. And I think we've all, or many of us, have seen these very emotional video clips on the news whenever there are these family reunions between North and South Korea, right? There have been at least 20, there have actually been 21 of these inter-Korean family reunions that only last for a few days, and then these family members have to say bye to each other again. So I'm not going to get too much into the history. Actually, Chahee Lee Stanfield, she's living history of the family separation and the legacy of the Korean War. But the point that I do want to make is that this issue of divided families is one that affects US citizens but one that affects Korean Americans. It's not just an issue that is over there, as a former president used to say, or a former congressman used to say, and not just a foreign issue, but one that actually affects US citizens and is an American issue. So if there's one takeaway, or one out of two takeaways, that's the first one. But first, about how I became involved and interested. I pulled together some family photos, actually. And I think maybe like many other Korean Americans of my generation, my grandparents had a huge impact on my upbringing. So even though I was born in Seoul, my family moved to New Jersey, which is where I grew up. And my parents were both working. So actually, my parents hired some free labor, my grandparents, to come and raise us, me and my brother. So it was my grandparents who taught us Korean, and it's thanks to them that I care about Korean culture and history, and had an interest in the Korean War and North Korea, because I later discovered that my grandfather on my mom's side, my Wadawaji, his family's hometown was originally in what is now North Korea, in Hwanghae-do. He had served in the Korean War. And on my dad's side, my Tsunarawaji, I later discovered that his older brother had been separated during the Korean War, and he had never been able to contact him again. So when I got to college, I actually never really made the link, no pun intended, between these divided families and Korean Americans until I discovered this documentary, the Divided Families film, which Chahee is a star in, made by this doctor named Jason An. And it was then when I realized that, wow, it's not just an issue that affects South Koreans or North Koreans. It's also one that hundreds, if not thousands, of Korean Americans are also affected by. So it's already been almost 6 years since I got involved with Divided Families USA. And to share a bit about what we tried to do is the ultimate vision is to try to bring closure to these elderly Korean Americans. And what I mean by closure is not necessarily the physical reunion, although that would be ideal, of being able to regularly see your loved one again or communicate with your loved one. But actually, in a survey that the Ministry of Unification of South Korea does every year, we've actually seen that the number one, should have built in a Zoom poll or something actually, but the number one thing that divided families in South Korea want is actually just to find out what happened to their loved ones in North Korea. I think over 60% say that's the number one thing that they want, because actually 92% of South Korean divided families don't know whatever happened to their loved ones in North Korea, including my own grandfather. So there are many different forms of what closure can look like. And I'll say this at the end, that one of the forms of closure can be sharing your story, especially to a family member yourself. So what does Divided Families USA try to do to achieve this vision? Try to do three things, each of which I'll talk about briefly. First one is advocacy. So on a political level, there's legislation in Congress, and we try to advocate with the US State Department and other organizations like the Red Cross as well, and partners like the South Korean government, who are really important in making reunions happen. We try to manage a registry. So Chahee is really the key player in this, in connecting with the first generation of Korean Americans. So unlike in South Korea, which keeps a really detailed registry and statistics on divided families, there's no official record of divided families in the US. So it's really up to community organizations like ours to have this registry for the State Department. And finally is recording stories, which personally I think is the most important thing. So in terms of advocacy, you can see a photo of Chahee here, who was testifying in Congress a few years ago, actually. And on the right, a photo of meeting with the UN Special Rapporteur on North Korean human rights. But since many of these elderly Korean American divided families, I think Chahee is an outlier actually, because as you will see, she's very eloquent in English and Korean, but many of them have been ashamed to speak out or have been unable to share their stories. So DFUSA tries to serve as a bridge, both in terms of language and also in terms of making the connections with the government officials between the elderly Korean American community and the policy community. The second thing we try to do is manage this registry. So if we have a small registry, now actually fewer than 100 individuals across the country, including in Alaska actually, and Hawaii, but mostly in the big cities where Korean Americans are, LA, Chicago, New York, Washington, DC, etc. And this may not be surprising that, as you can see in this graph, the vast majority of the divided families on our registry are in their 80s and 90s. So it almost seems cliche at this point to say, but I think it's apparent. I think it's very, it feels so real to me because I hear stories of families passing away every few months, that time is running out for this issue. And, you know, as I said, there are no official statistics on the US side, but I think we can glean some important lessons by looking at the statistics from the Ministry of Unification in South Korea. So everyone says there are always 10 million Korean divided families from the Korean War, but actually officially, there are only about 133,000 South Korean divided families officially registered. And in the latest survey, I think it's end of last year in South Korea, I think only about 40,000, 47,000 or so out of the 133,000 are still alive out of the South Korean divided families. So I think that gives you a sense of the urgency of this issue. And also because of the fact that out of those divided families in South Korea, 91% said they still want to reunite with their families in North Korea. And just from my own conversations, and as you'll hear from Chahee, this is very much the case for many divided families in the US as well. And then the last part, which I'll share, I'm going to share a short video in just a second, is of recording stories. Because as I mentioned, one form of closure can be, if done properly, sharing your story, your message to your loved one, even if they may never respond. But just getting that off your chest after 70 years can be very powerful. So I'll just share a short video that I recorded. I think it's already been 3 years. But
트럼프 대통령이 저는 이현준입니다. 4월 22일 1927년생입니다. 제가 출생지는 평안북도 운산군 운산면 송현동이라고 군소재이에요. 제 이북의 부일은 1931년 1월 10일이에요, 생일이. 걔 이름이 이덕영이에요. 큰 독자 기령자. 내가 영어를 못해도 시리즈입니다. 여기서 사는 지가 40년이 넘었습니다. 저희들을 도와주세요. 동물들도 사랑하고 사는데 제가 벌써 이게 70년이 됩니다. 20대 청춘에 해는 사람들 보고 싶은 거에 이제 눈물이 말랐어요. 부모 처자식을 버리고 와서 내가 무슨 복을 받겠다고 이렇게 살아있어요. 회개하라고 살아있는 것 같은데 아무쪼록 하나님 아버지 저희 서울 부모를 도와주옵소서. 하나님 아버지 모든 전쟁을 그만하고 삽시다.
Yeah, actually, even though I've seen that video so many times, yeah, it's still very emotional for me. I think especially because only about, I think less than a year, Chahee had told me that Mr. Hyunjun Lee had actually passed away. So I think that just shows to me the urgency of, it was probably one of the last messages that he delivered from his deathbed. So, you know, especially now, I think, what can we do? You know, what can just normal people, especially the younger generation, what can we do about this issue? And oftentimes when it comes to North Korea, as Namsik mentioned, it may seem really big, and you hear these geopolitical issues about peace treaties and denuclearization, and it all often makes me wonder, you know, what can I do about this issue? But I guess the good thing about this issue of divided families is that there's anyone can get involved, because, you know, I think there are many challenges to face-to-face reunions, even video reunions, because of the travel ban, because of COVID, because of sanctions, because of political deadlock, many reasons why it may be difficult for reunions to happen. In the meantime, I think my final message is that I think maybe the next best form of closure may be helping record and listen to these stories before it's too late. So one example of this is through a podcast project that I started with the team. It's been almost more than 2 years actually. And now we have an awesome team. And the idea is to serve as a platform for connecting different stories of family separation, not just from the Korean War, but also from the US-Mexico border, or the Holocaust, or Cuba, or the Xinjiang's, or the Uyghurs in Xinjiang. And part of the motivation for this is that, especially during the pandemic, we've seen so many people isolated and separated from their own families and loved ones, even on a temporary level. So the last message that I'll share before turning it back to Namsik, I think, is that I'll just encourage you all to have these conversations. You don't even need to interview anybody or have a documentary or a podcast. Just if you have someone in your own family, whether a grandfather or grandmother, or know an elderly person in your family who may have this history of family separation, just try to engage in a conversation about them, because that's what I wish I had done with my own grandfather before it was too late. So that's the final message I'll leave with you all, and thanks so much again.
Okay, thank you so much, Paul, for sharing your insight and your passion on this really important issue, and for really introducing this pressing issue to many of us here on this call, for the work that Divided Families USA is doing, as well as, you know, the work that you and your team have been doing to fulfill the aspirations of our grandparents' generations to finally be reunited and meet with their family members whom they've been apart from for over 70 years now. And it's truly inspiring work. So thank you once again, Paul, for that speech. To learn more about Paul's work, the Divided Families USA website link will be posted in the chat box. Also, I highly recommend checking out the Divided Families podcast, which is available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and SoundCloud. And you can also follow them on Instagram. And I also personally listen to the podcast as well, and truly inspiring stories that Paul and his guests who he has on that they talk about. So now I would like to introduce our second speaker for tonight's event. Chahee Lee Stanfield was born in Manchuria in 1940. And in 1945, when Korea became independent from Japan, her mother and 5 siblings left for South Korea and became separated from her father and one of her brothers in Manchuria. Later in 1968, she came to the United States to study at Indiana University. While working as a librarian at the Chicago Public Library, Stanfield learned of the many Korean Americans who were separated from their families in North Korea. In 2008, she founded the National Coalition on the Divided Families. And in 2010, Divided Families USA, the 3rd generation of Korean Americans, founded by Dr. Jason An and later led by Paul Kyumin Lee, started working with the National Coalition. They have worked for the last 10 years together with US lawmakers to pass the bills and resolutions that would facilitate reunions for divided family members here in America. So let's all welcome up Chahee Lee Stanfield. Chahee, can you unmute yourself?
Here.
Oh, yes, we can hear you.
Okay, there you go. Thank you so much for having me here, and hi, everybody. I am a member of an endangered species disappearing from the earth called the divided families. I was born in a deep mountain village called Chahee in Manchuria, which was a Korean guerrilla hideout when Korea was under Japanese rule. My father owned the vast lands in Manchuria, and he had 100 to 120 men cultivating the agricultural land in Chahee. And these men worked during the day, but at night they were armed to protect the village from the bandits, which were common in those days. According to the area history and my family, my father provided food and weapons to the Korean guerrillas. And one of the leaders of the fighters was the future Prime Minister Kim Il-sung of North Korea. And one of the fighters was my father's youngest brother. My father also built a road between Dunha and the Chahee, which was built ideal for the Korean fighters to ambush the Japanese troops. In the summer of 1988, I went to China to find out what happened to my father and my brother. And I took the road to Chahee, which was a legendary road in my childhood dreams. On the way to Chahee, there was a mountain in the distance where ruins of the old Korea dynasty were. And we went through deep valley where hundreds of Japanese troops were ambushed and killed by the Korean fighters. And at the end of the road, there was my birthplace where a beautiful blue river was running through. An official from Duna City took me to a hill. When we reached the top of the hill, I saw a breathtaking, endless green agricultural field waving in the August sun on the other side of the hill. And I was just stunned by the overwhelming enormity of the green sea, which seemed to be impossible in such a deep mountain village like Chahee. When I climbed to the top of the hill, I reached a glimpse of the reality beyond 45 years ago. And my family stories, which only existed in my story, fairy tale storybook, became reality. And I wept. And I wept at the river of Chahee, where my brothers played when they were kids without knowing their future. And hundreds of young men washed their sweat, tears, and nostalgia for their ill-fated country, and yet renewed their dreams and hopes to get the country back. And that day, I learned my father and my brother moved to North Korea in 1949. When World War II was over and my family decided to return home, which was a Daegu city in the southern part of South Korea. And my mother, my 3 brothers and my sisters and I left for South Korea. But my father and one of my brothers, Ung-hee, stayed in Manchuria to wrap up the business. They were to join us in a week or so. But that was the last time we saw them. That's how my family was split forever. Right after we left, the border between China and North Korea was closed, and they became trapped in Manchuria. In the late 1940s, there was the last civil war called Shopping Battle in Manchuria. And the Chinese government appointed my father as the commander of a battalion, and they were sent to the battle. And my father was victorious. On August 30th, 1949, the Chinese government presented a certificate of appreciation to my father and granted my father's wishes to move to North Korea. And my father and Ung-hee moved to North Korea at the end of 1940. In 1992, my nephew, who was a Methodist church minister in Chicago, visited North Korea with a group of ministers. When he was in Pyongyang, he mentioned my father's name to the guide. A few days later, when he returned to his hotel, there was Ung-hee, my brother and his son were waiting for me. I mean, there was a surprising reunion. And we learned that my father had passed away. After that, Ung-hee wrote to me twice, but his letter abruptly stopped in the end of 1990s. And I don't know whether he's still alive or not. But we learned what had happened to my father and Ung-hee after they had left China. Shortly after my father and Ung-hee arrived in North Korea, the Korean War broke out. And Ung-hee was conscripted into the North Korean army and fought for North Korea, while my 3 other brothers fought for South Korea, and one of them was killed. When the war was over, that's Ung-hee's family, North Korean family. When the war was over, Ung-hee returned home, but this time the 38th parallel was drawn between North and South Korea. And my father and Ung-hee became trapped in North Korea. Then my father realized that he had a long, difficult road ahead of him to reunite with his family in South Korea. At the age of 54, he started running marathons. And later he became famous as an athlete, educator, and inspirational speaker. They called him Chalima Harabaji. Chalima means a legendary horse which runs long distances. And Harabaji means grandpa. At the request of Prime Minister Kim Il-sung, they made a movie about him. And the Prime Minister entitled the movie Lee Sang-mun, the 60-year-old youth. And my father knew that his worst enemy was time. He thought he could beat time as long as he ran marathons. And he ran marathons even when he was in his 70s. In 2010, a group of Harvard University students, led by Jason Ahn, produced a documentary film on the divided families. And Jason and his team obtained a copy of that movie from North Korea. And some of the scenes from the movie are in Dr. Jason's Divided Families. It's http://dividedfamilies.com. In 1989, the year after I visited China, I transferred in the Albany Park branch of the Chicago Public Library as the branch manager, which was located in the heart of the Korean community at that time. Within 5 years, I obtained 2 Illinois state grants and built a Korean language book and non-book collections worth $147,000. And that collection brought crowds of Korean patrons from all of the Chicago 107 suburbs and the Midwest. Then I learned that a lot of my patrons were divided family members. In March 2000, I went to see a man named Mark Kirk, who was running for Congress. And I reported him about the Korean American divided families. And I presented an estimated 100,000 Korean divided family members. And I also reported him that in 10 years, most of them would pass away. The congressman took our issue to his heart, and he adopted our issue in the US government policy. He passed one resolution in the House and the Senate, and he passed 2 bills in the Senate and in the House. And the first bill was signed by President George W. Bush on January 8th, 2008. The second bill was signed by President Obama on December 16th, 2009. And the President Obama appointed Ambassador Robert King as our divided family ambassador. And in April 2010, my coalition, including Mr. Chris Chung, who is watching this program in Atlanta, and we went to DC and we met ambassador and discussed how to reunite the divided families. Since then, we passed 3 resolutions in the House, 1 bill in the Senate, and presently there is 1 bill introduced by Senator Mazie Hirono and Senator Van Sullivan. Meanwhile, millions of divided families, for more information on these bills and resolutions, please check our website, dividedfamilies.org. dividedfamiliesusa.org. Meanwhile, millions of divided family members, including my father in North Korea, my mother and sister in Chicago, and my 3 brothers, possibly 4, have passed away. They all had stories which were too painful to bury in their hearts and carry to their graves, but in the end, they have all died. In April 2019, I presented the State Department a list of 97 Korean American divided families members. And as Paul mentioned, 85% of them were in their late 80s and in their 90s. We are a fast disappearing species from the earth. Please help us. Please write to your congressmen and the senators and the 4 Korean American congressmen and women. Thank you so much. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much, Chahee, for sharing your heartfelt testimony and truly for your ongoing efforts to give Koreans here in America the opportunity to reunite with their separated family members. Your message truly inspires us to urgently support and advocate for this issue. As you mentioned, time is running out for those Korean divided family members who are getting older. And we really pray that a day will come when Korea is reunited and families are able to finally come together. So thank you again, Chahee, for that heartfelt testimony. And thank you also to Paul for your presentation. So that is it for our speakers' presentations. And now it is time for the Q&A session, where you guys are able to directly ask any questions to our speakers. If you would like to ask a question, you can simply click on the Reactions tab first, then click on the Raise Hand button. I will call your name and you can unmute yourself. If you would also like to type your question in the chat box, you may do so as well, and I can read off the questions from the chat. So one thing that I do ask though, before you ask your question, please make sure to state your name, where you're from, and specify who your question is to, either to Paul, to Chahee, or to both speakers. So who would like to ask the first question in our Q&A? Okay, it looks like we have Emma who raised her hand. Emma, you may unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hi, Emma, you guys know me. I had a question about, I love that you guys focus a lot on the older generations with Divided Families USA. I was just wondering, obviously every year people leave North Korea and are separated from their families. Do you think at any point in Divided Families USA, the focus will turn to like younger generations who face this same separation? It's to both Chahee and Paul too.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Paul is the 3rd generation, and some of the 3rd generation's parents were not even born during the Korean War. So the 4th generation don't know much about the Korean War. Also, it's their grandparents' story. Even though it's their heritage, it's I don't know whether they really have the urgency of going to North Korea and meeting their cousins. I mean, so they are so busy with the life in this country. So I doubt it. But I'm so grateful. This is our generation. It took so long for us to work with the U.S. government because we had this Cold War mentality, and we didn't even want to let our neighbors know that we had our family members in North Korea. I mean, definitely not U.S. government. No, we had family members in North Korea when we I'm talking about in 1980s. So it took long because of also besides it's the language and the cultural barrier. In 1990s, I knew I had to do something, but I didn't know where to start. I did a search, and there were no literature or no documents whatsoever for me to present, to take to the issue to the U.S. government. So I had to start from nothing. So the third generation, I mean, this is I'm so grateful that our young third generation came and they took our cross, carry our cross. I mean, it's hard for us. We all have a language problem, but you know, Paul.
Not you, Chahee, not you.
Yeah. Go ahead, I'm done.
Okay. I just want to add on to what Chahee said in response to Emma's question about younger generations. And I guess I'll say two things. The first one is, I think it's difficult because I don't know about the South Korean government, but at least with the US government, they prioritize, you know, when we update them with this registry of divided families, they want to prioritize the direct family links, whether it's siblings or husband and wife. And so if it's a bit further than that, if the connection is a bit more removed, the government officials were more hesitant to engage on the issue. But I think if I had, you know, my dream project, and to give you a sense, the South Korean government has been collecting letters and video messages from South Korean divided families for many, many years. And I think I just saw a report in the survey of the Ministry of Unification. I think there's a backlog of these thousands of letters since 2005, if I'm not mistaken, that have not been delivered to North Korea. So these are letters and video messages South Korean divided families have written, but North Korea has not accepted them or delivered them. So they're just in this vacuum. But if I had just had unlimited resources, and dream project would be to collect the stories of Korean American divided families and deliver them to their family members in North Korea, so that even if, maybe one day when North Korea opens up, maybe not the direct family members, but maybe their children, maybe their descendants can watch those video messages or read those letters. And then the other point that I wanted to make, when we think of divided families, we often think of the elderly generation. But part of what we're also trying to do with the podcast is think about other families divided from the Korean War. For example, North Korean escapees, many of whom, I would say most of whom, are divided families as well. Some of them came with their family members to South Korea or other countries, but many of them came alone. Many of them had to leave family members behind. So I would just encourage everyone to think of a more expansive interpretation of Korean divided families.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Emma, for that question. It makes us really think a lot about how us young people can get involved, and for Chahee and Paul for kind of elaborating and expanding upon that. And yeah, I believe truly that that is a very important point that Paul made in terms of this divided families issue, not simply being an issue that is relevant to the older generation, our grandparents' generation, but really it affects us young people as well. And we can do so much. There's so much potential for us to support and contribute. So thank you so much for that question. Who would like to ask the next question to any of our speakers? Okay, looks like we have Suni Kim who raised her hand. Suni, you may unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yeah, I know I have problems with my microphone. Can you guys hear me?
Yes,
Okay,
we can hear you
so,
well.
Yes, so my question is, like, as of this moment, what's like the biggest obstacle that's kind of preventing, divided families from reuniting at the moment? Is it like an issue of like, maybe like North Korean government is not like as open to these talks at the moment, or is it some kind of other like foreign interference? Because I know with issues regarding foreign policy like this, it feels like it's so out of our hands as citizens, and like the letters that we're writing, it might not have an impact. So I was wondering, what is this biggest problem that that needs to be addressed, and what can we as citizens kind of do to help that out?
Yeah. Okay, the biggest issue is our issue is a humanitarian issue, but North Korea as well as the US government have been using it as a political issue. So in a way, we have not been treated as a human issue. So that's one of the problems. But it's fine. In 2011, the US government decided to open up a dialogue with North Korea, and they used our card, and which is fine. We don't care how we are used, but just as long as they work on the reunification, we don't mind. But the main problem has been the political. They use it as a political tool.
Yeah, Suni, I've been thinking about that question a lot, and I think, as Chahee said, it's sad that, as you may know, North Korea can be very polarizing. That there's like the human rights camp, regime change camp, and then there's also the engagement camp, or the whatever you want to call it, pro-peace, engagement, humanitarian camp. And oftentimes we have to choose between one side or the other. But actually, divided families, family reunions are an issue that both sides can actually agree on in theory. And it's easy to just, of course, North Korea bears a lot of responsibility, because if they wanted to, they could have allowed free travel and communication. Chahee could have kept on having the letters or visits to her half brother a long time ago. So definitely a lot of the onus is on North Korea. But when it comes to family reunions, it actually takes both sides, or in this case, multiple sides: South Korea, the US, and North Korea. And when it comes to North Korea policy, so I'm just speaking on personal capacity here, the US government has really prioritized security issues, especially denuclearization and sanctions, over a lot of these human issues, like divided families. And actually, so Chahee mentioned a lot of legislation in Congress, and that's really great in helping bring attention to this as an American issue and having the show of support. But actually, it just takes the president, actually, or the executive branch, who can make reunions happen, or maybe not unilaterally, but can kind of, what's the word, initiate the reunion process if they wanted to, if there was enough political will for them to want to do so. But currently, because there's so many other priorities going on, that's very difficult. But to give a very concrete example, so in the Singapore summit between Trump and Kim Jong-un, the issue of the prisoner of war and missing in action, POW, MIA, remains issue was mentioned explicitly as one of the 4 parts of the Singapore statement. And that's really due to the advocacy of many different veterans and POW, MIA organizations who successfully lobbied for this to be part of that statement. So if there's enough political influence on the divided families issue, that could also be a possibility in the future.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Suni, for that question, and Chahee and Paul for answering, allowing us to kind of have a greater insight into what are the major obstacles getting in the way of these family reunions. So thank you so much for that answer and question. Who would like to ask the next question to our speakers? Okay, looks like we have Joanna Jung. Raise your hand, Joanna. You may unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yeah. Oh wait, can you hear me okay? Okay, sounds good. First off, I just want to say thank you so much to Paul and Chahee for coming today and collaborating with BU Link and sharing your personal story, Chahee, and also just giving a lot more, like a bigger platform to this really big issue that I think many people still are not very aware of, but so that's kind of leading into my question. So what would you say is the biggest message that you want to give to like kind of like the younger Korean generations, like my age? Like what's one thing that you would want them to know, and one thing that you would want them to kind of spread the word for?
In our 80s and 90s, there is a limit for us what we can do. And luckily, we got these bright young people at your age. They have starting 2000, even before 2010, they started helping us. So you can do a lot of things we cannot do. We are just mentally, we are not equipped to handle this with the US government, with in language-wise and culture-wise. So you are not too young to help us. It's a big, big task. But for an example, when we started, when we had a Symphony project, the director was she just graduated college, MIT, is young. Then she organized, she formed a congressional commission to work on our issue. For the first time in US history, she used high school students. She let them go to, they all carried their book bags and went to their congressmen and talked to them. That's how we got, we had a congressional commission of 11 members. The young people moved, actually. This is this is something we couldn't do. And you can reach your congressmen and senators. Right now, actually, you can reach the US government directly. They don't need, we have done enough resolutions and then passing bills. We don't need it. It's just one person in the US government who is in the right position to open our dialogue with North Korea. That's all it takes. You can do it. You guys can do that. We can't.
Joanna, I guess my answer to your question about one message, one thing that I would leave to the younger generation is that I think this issue is something that's very much alive, even though maybe endangered species, but not extinct yet.
No.
And I think that many times we even look at this issue like it's already in the history books, like we've already closed the page on it. So if you want to do something very tangible for North Korea, I think there are many opportunities with North Korean escapees, North Korean defectors as well. But I think this is a very, very tangible issue that might start from your own family. But beyond that, I think this is something that I'm realizing more. I think it has made me think a lot about my own identity as a Korean American. Thinking about what makes me uniquely Korean American, or how can I tell my Korean American story to other people. And I think being a divided family member, being part of this community is really essential to that, especially because so many Korean Americans, I don't think there's an official statistic for this, but so many Korean immigrants to the US were originally from North Korea, maybe because they were not permanently able to settle in South Korea, or they wanted to find somewhere else to resettle. And oftentimes this has made me reflect on issue of trauma and generational trauma, because actually it could have been our parents' generation, the second generation of Korean Americans, who could have tried to help with this healing and closure process. We often say they were too busy working or providing for our family to do that. So it's fallen to us, the third generation, try to have these difficult conversations within our own families. So I guess that was really,
Actually,
you asked for one message, but I said three different
actually,
things.
it was our fault, because when we came here, we wanted our children to be far, far away from our generation's tragedy. We didn't want, so we wanted just, we wanted our children to become, to achieve the American dream. But a strange thing happened. This is a remarkable, I mean, just an unbelievable thing happened. When they grew up and then achieved their dreams, they flew back to their roots. And that's Jason, you guys, to help us. This is something, yeah, it's our kids. I'm done. I'm sorry. I'm done.
Thank you so much, Joanna, for that question. In terms of how us younger people can be involved and contribute to this important cause, and for Chahee and Paul for those answers. Is there anyone who would like to ask a question as well to our speakers here in the audience? Let's see.
Yeah, I want to. I don't know how to raise my hand though.
Oh, I can hear you though. So, John Lee, yeah, you may
Hey,
ask a question.
Paul. Hey, Chahee.
Hi.
Hi. It's so great to see both of you. This is really inspiring. And I just wanted to add on a question to Joanna's. Paul and Chahee, you've both been such inspirations for me to kind of investigate and encourage my own family to share a story and be willing to do that, even if it's a painful experience. How would you kind of encourage us to, like all of us here, those of us for whom the divided families issue in North Korea feels really relevant to our own families, and those of us who just have families that have experienced division in other ways, to have that spirit of sharing story and being willing to move that towards action, even if maybe it feels like there's a fear of bringing back pain. And yeah, what sort of encouragement would you give us?
I'm curious to hear about you, because you're fearless in sharing your story. I don't know to what extent you share with your own family, your own kids or grandkids. But that's really been an inspiration for me, because I know that's definitely not the case for most other Korean American divided families. I think for me, it's been a challenge as well, especially with my own family. Like, if you haven't talked about something, especially something so traumatic, like your whole life, even since before I was born, it's kind of difficult to just raise it up. Even if I talk to my grandmother every day on the phone, for example. So I think just one thing that I've tried is by watching something together, like watching, for example, I saw this movie, 국제시장, Ode to My Father, already kind of an old movie now, several years ago. but I actually watched it in Seoul with my grandparents. And usually my grandfather is like falling asleep as soon as the lights dim in the movie, but he was actually crying. So I think that was an opportunity for me to actually ask him. He was able to open up a bit more about being separated from his older brother, actually. And that was part of why he was so moved by that movie. So I think maybe not broaching it directly, but having like a third medium to work with has been helpful for me. But Chahee, I'm curious.
Yeah, please work with Paul, and we need to organize and set the direction we can all work on together.
Okay. Well, yeah, thank you so much, John, for that question. In terms of how we can be able to engage with and share these kind of and hear these kind of stories. Yeah, actually, that movie that Paul mentioned also, I saw too, and it's highly recommended in terms of being able to see in movie the pain and kind of experience that divided families go through that they had to go through after the Korean War. So thank you, John, for that question. Is there anyone else who would like to ask another question? We're a little bit over the 1 hour mark now, and so I believe we'll have time for maybe 1 or 2 more questions. So if there's anyone out here who would like to ask our speakers a question, you may do so.
I also want to learn the results of the giveaway. Everyone in suspense.
We'll get there soon. So if there's no one here who wants to ask a question, there was a question that did come in through the registration link. This is a question that came from Claire Che from Binghamton University in New York. And her question to our speakers is, are there other branches of your organization? So I believe she means Divided Family USA. Are there other branches that works to reunite other Koreans of the diaspora outside of the US? So that is Claire's question that she asked through the registration.
I don't know any other organizations. No. Yes. I know in South Korea, it's the Korean Red Cross is in charge of doing this, but we don't have any organization or government department which can do that. We are on our own.
Yeah. What I know South Korea has a lot of actual government infrastructure. I think what I do know is that in the past, so before the travel ban, a lot of Korean American divided families went through brokers in China or Canada, but actually many were quite disappointed because they ended up not working out, or it was a scam, or you had to pay way too much money and it wasn't 100% certain. And I actually tried asking the Canadian North Korean Human Rights Organization about this, and they weren't aware of any counterparts. I think what I can imagine, though, is that there are Korean diaspora all over the world who are affected by family separation as well. So if there's anyone else out there, love to speak with you and partner with you.
Okay, well, thank you, Claire, for asking that question in the registration link and for the response. We have time now for one more question. So I want to give everyone in the audience a chance if there was any kind of question that was hanging in their minds to ask to our speakers right now. Is there anyone who would like to ask a question here? Okay, looks like we have Violet Barton, who raised her hand. Violet, you may ask your question to our speakers.
Yeah, hi. This question is for both of you. I'm Violet, I'm from Chicago. I I was wondering, what are the most important bills remaining to be passed by Congress, or actions the U.S. has not yet taken regarding helping divided families? Or should we be asking our representatives to create new bills that speak to this?
We passed 2 bills, but one was in 2008 and the other one was 2009. It went down. Nothing happened, and we passed those 4 resolutions, all kind of things. Like the bill want to. It's good to keep our issue alive, to give pressure to the U.S. government, but it's up to the U.S. government, their policy, and they have to just we hope someone to see this as a humanitarian issue, not a political issue. We just need one person in the U.S. government who is in the position to make a decision. So it's a very simple, but it's very complicated because it has North Korea, as well as Paul mentioned, even at one time, one South Korean government, and they used our issue as their political purpose.
Yeah, Violet, I think, yeah, so I just put in the chat the link to the bill that actually passed the House of Representatives last year. And it actually was introduced in the Senate as well. The bill that Chahee mentioned with Senator Hirono and Sullivan in October, but it hasn't moved anywhere since it was introduced. And I think there are only 6 members of Congress who signed on to the bill. And I think given everything that's going on with Ukraine and COVID and many other foreign policy priorities, it looks unlikely that the bill will actually will pass the Senate or be signed into law. So that's just to answer your question directly. But again, I think it's all about the political will. Many people may have noticed that North Korea wasn't even mentioned in the State of the Union address earlier this week. Whereas earlier in the Biden administration, Korea and even Korean American divided families was mentioned. For example, when President Biden met with President Moon, I think in September 2021, I would say, was the last summit. There was actually a direct mention of working toward reunions of Korean American divided families. But that language has been lost in the rhetoric and in the policy statements since then. So that's where things are now. Yeah, I didn't want to end on a grim note, but on the political side, I think that's where things stand. But that's not to say that I think on the community level and on the family level, there's a lot that we can still do, as I said, to record the stories, to build the registry, and to provide closure in our own way.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Violet, for that question. And if you guys do want to read more into the bill that was passed to the House that Paul just put in the chat, HR 826, the Divided Families Reunification Act, you can look into that as well. And yeah, although it may seem that things may not move on a political level, as Paul was mentioning there, and as Chahee spoke to, there's so much that I believe we as average citizens can also do in terms of supporting this cause. So thank you so much for that question. So this concludes our speaker event, Reuniting the Divided Korean Family. I want to express my utmost gratitude to Paul and Chahee for making the time to speak with all of us tonight and for sharing your stories. Thank you to the Link BU team for co-organizing this event with us, to our tech team for helping us run the event here on Zoom. And lastly, thank you to you all for coming out tonight and wanting to learn more about this really important issue of divided families. So please be on the lookout for the post-event survey once you leave the Zoom meeting. And I hope everyone stays healthy during this time, and I wish the best of luck to all of the students throughout the remainder of the semester. So good night, everyone.